Um, I'm with the Coalition to Reform Money. That's what we want to do. We'd like to change the way money is created and the way we'd like to change the way money is created and the way that it's brought into circulation. Is Iowa having any money problems, or?
Everybody's got money problems.
Is the United States of America having any money problems?
We're all investing in derivatives, no problem.
There you go. Okay. Well, I think you're right, and I think it's getting worse instead of better. And the way I got involved with this thing was in May of 1992. I work at a radio station, KUS AM and FM in Austin, Minnesota. I've been there 17 years, and a couple of fellows came in with a cassette tape of a fellow named Bo Grice was running for president. And they came in when my father was there, and my dad told me about it, and he knew that I really didn't care for many of the candidates that I had a choice of back then. And he said, well, why don't you listen to this cassette tape of this fella and see what you think? And so I had about a half-hour trip to visit one of my customers in Spring Valley, Minnesota, and I plugged it in the cassette deck. Bo was on a radio show out of WHO out of Des Moines there. And of all the things that Bo said, he said that the Federal Reserve was not a government agency or department or anything like that. It was a private outfit. Well, that's the first time I'd heard that, and I couldn't imagine what would be wrong with that, but I thought maybe there could be something wrong with it. I couldn't figure out how that might be a problem, but I thought, you know, if you put the nation's money supply in charge of a private company, that there probably could be a problem with that. And so for a long time I wondered about that, and then I came across a piece of paper from a group called Fund to Restore an Educated Electorate, free, out of Texas, and it said, at the top it said, our flawed money system failing. And I started reading it, and gee whiz, I read a whole bunch of things in there that I'd never read before, and one of those things was that the banks created all the money. And it just, I couldn't understand that, and they said they did it with demand accounts, checking accounts, and that it was all brought into circulation as a loan. I mean, I just, how could a bank create money? I just couldn't imagine, you know, and I got to one point in the paper, and in big bold letters it said, however, in this process, only the principal is created, never the interest. And I'd never read those words before, and I read them again and again, because, you know, when it's in big black and bold, that's supposed to be important. But I just, what do they mean? Just the principle is created, never the interest? I said, that would have to create some kind of a problem, wouldn't it? But of course, you couldn't hardly go ask anybody else, because nobody else knew what you was talking about either. Well, anyway, a fellow by the name of Milt Bioch said, well, Greg, if you really want to understand this money, you got to go listen to a fellow who'll be speaking up at St. Louis Park, Minnesota, and he understands this better than anybody else. And so in January of '93, I think it was, I went up to St. Louis Park, Minnesota, and there was a gentleman there by the name of Byron Dale, and he calmly and politely got up there and started talking about money, and man, I'd never heard what this guy was talking about before, but he sure made a lot of sense. And I mean, it really made a lot of sense. And after that time that he was speaking, I went over to the table there and I started asking him some questions. And he would answer most of my questions, but he said, you know, if you really want to understand this, he says, you ought to pick up this book and read it, and then after you read it, if you have any questions, call me and I'll be glad to talk to you about it. And that book that he was talking about was this one here called Bashed by the Bankers. And it's the craziest looking book I ever saw. It really didn't look very professional, and this guy was on there, and it's a paperback book, and but I said, okay, if you tell me to, I'll read it. So I took that, and I took another one called Tales of the Treasury. And 3-4 days later, I got on the phone to call Byron, and at that time he lived about 50 miles from me, and I talked to him for 3 hours on the telephone, asking him questions about this money. And I had to hang up because my phone bill was going up. I thought I had big phone bills back then, and they're really big now. But anyway, he said, well, can I call you back? I got some more questions. Would you talk to me some more about this? He said, sure. So 2 days later, I called him back for 3 more hours. And I realized at that point that I really had a problem, because I lived in this country where this money was kind of goofed up. And the other thing that bothered me, and it still does today, and you know, I can pick up Backs by the Bankers, and I can start reading that book, and it just about makes me cry. Yes, sir.
Can you mention the author again?
Byron Dale, right here. And we have some of those books back there eventually. Byron will get some out on the table for you. But when I opened up that book and I read that story about what happened to a man in my country, and you know, I was pretty green back then. I thought America was a fair and square place, and if you all worked hard and you went out and were fair and honest, that you could make a decent life for yourself. Now, I didn't know that all the things that I know now that goes on in America, and my impression of America today is entirely different from what it was back then. And I open that book up today and I go back through and I read it as a reference book sometimes, and it just, I told Byron, I said, would you mind if I went with you when you went to speak to people? And I'll just sit back there at your table and listen, but I want to learn it, and I want to hear what people say. I want to hear their questions that they ask you, and I'd like to help you. Because quite frankly, this is not Byron Dale's personal problem. It's my problem. And it's everybody's problem who lives in this country. And he said, well, sure. So I started doing what I'm doing now. And for the past couple of years, we've done a lot of things. We started, been to Washington, D.C. I've been there twice with Byron. Byron's been there 3-4 times. We've run all over the country and speak to different groups of people, and we have a lot of people call us on the telephone and talk to us, write letters to us. We started a monthly newsletter. We call it the Money Talks Journal. We started that last May, and we've been putting that out every month. And we got subscribers in 38 states, and it's growing all the time. And I don't know, I think that something's happening on this issue out there. I think, quite frankly, the American people are starting to understand that taxes aren't the root of the problem. They're a symptom of the problem. And besides that the taxation doesn't work, and of course our founding fathers knew that. But anyway, I think as we talk about balancing the budget, for example, what it's really getting down to now is American people are trying to decide who's going to get ripped off, who's going to lose, and who's going to win. Because when you balance the budget, that's what has to happen. And I think really if you had an honest money system, you wouldn't have a deficit, you wouldn't have a national debt in the first place. But if you get anybody in there serious enough to try to balance the budget, there's only 2 things that's going to happen, 1 of 2 things. You're going to have greater pressure for more taxes, or you're just going to have a lot more human suffering than what you got now. And so let's hope that they don't balance the budget. As a matter of fact, if we can't change the money system, I think we should go in debt further and have a good time. But anyway, so I started doing some studying too, because Byron, you know, he wrote a lot of letters to the Treasury, and that was basically 1982 and 83. So I wanted to write those same questions to the Treasury and see if they'd send me the same answers, or maybe they changed their mind, they did things differently now. And in the process of writing those letters, I found out that they don't answer the questions any differently today than they did back then. This is one of the first ones I wrote to the Treasury, and of course I wanted to know what money was and where it came from and how it was created. And they sent me back the same answers that Byron got 10, 11 years before that. And they said that the actual creation of money always involves the extension of credit by private commercial banks. Now, I know some of you raised your hand that you were here before, that Byron had talked about this, and some of you were not here before. And I was just curious now, when I put that letter from the Treasury up there, And it says the actual creation of money always involves the extension of credit by private commercial banks. Is that curious to any of you? Is it new information, or does everybody know that? Did everybody know that all the money is created when a bank makes a loan?
Well, when they borrow the money.
When we borrow the
When
money.
the bank borrows the money from the Federal Reserve or whatever.
Okay, but you
It's
know.
out of thin air, it's nothing, it's just paper.
Okay, what is it? It's a debit to a loan account and a credit to a checking account, but the banks don't borrow any money from the Federal Reserve. Okay. They can, if they're not a real sharp bank. I mean, heck, if you create it out of thin air, why would you need to go and borrow it from the Federal Reserve? But this was a statement, and I couldn't understand, because, you know, I always heard about the printing presses. And the Federal Reserve, no, the green dollar bills, how would it, do they got a little room in the back there? Does the bank print them bills up or so? How could, does anybody here know specifically how a bank creates the money? Well, I'll get into that, because that's what I wanted to know is, golly, how does a bank create the money? And by the way, you know, when we founded this country, if you go back to the gold and silver thing, although you could use some bank credit for money back then, basically what we were using was gold and silver, and there's a lot of people that would like to use gold and silver again. I haven't run into any of the gold and silver people who really understand how gold and silver came into circulation, because most of them talk about being on the gold and silver standard. And I don't want to be on a gold and silver standard, because if you go to the Congressional Research Office or the Library of Congress, and I got my copy of this from Byron. I don't know if you have to get it through your congressman or senator, or if it's one of those pieces of information you can just send for and still get on your own. But in 1792, basically what it says here, and I don't know if you can read it that well, but I'll read it to you. It says, "It shall be lawful for any person or persons to bring to the said mint gold and silver bullion, in order to there be coined, and that the bullion so brought shall be there assayed and coined as speedily as possible, at the free of expense to the person who brought it in." And what that meant is that not when we're on the gold and silver standard, but when we use gold and silver for money, you and I created that money the way we create anything else. We had to go out and work for it. You had to dig it out of the ground, mine it out of the ground, pan it. But it just didn't jump out into your pocket. You had to do something for it, you know, and that's what we think we're teaching our children. You don't get something for nothing, you gotta work for it. And that's what the Founding Fathers decided how we would create our money, because back then the Spanish mill dollar floated all over the world and everybody used that, you know, and I think that came into circulation when the King of Spain told his servants to go out and dig him some silver out of the ground. Of course, he owned all the property, so they do whatever he said to do, and then they brought that raw resource back to him, and he coined it into money. And then he took it downtown to the marketplace, and he spent it into circulation for all those things that the people were making to make his castle nice. But it went in as a wealth with no debt attached to it, and you and I and all the rest of us accepted it as a medium of exchange. It was a benefit to all of us because there was no debt attached to it, and we could exchange it for, if Joe made a chair from a tree out in his backyard, or somebody else made something with their labor, we'd barter it, change it. That was a good thing, and we could be prosperous, and the Founding Fathers liked that idea, but says we're not going to use Spanish mill dollars, we're going to have American money. So they took those same principles, passed the law, 1792 Coinage Act, and said, now any of you people who want money, you can actually have money, and you don't have to be in debt for it. You just go out and dig that resource out of the ground with your labor, bring it back to your U.S. Mint, who will do something wonderful for you, and they'll coin that nuggets or dust or whatever raw shape it was in, into coins free of charge, give it all back to you, and then you walk down the road with money that people accepted, and you didn't have to be in debt for it. You did have to work for it. And the reason I want to show you that, because Byron's going to talk this afternoon, really for the first time expand on the solution to fixing this problem, and the solution is based upon these principles, combining labor with raw resources of the earth to produce a benefit for everyone, monetize it free of charge, and we can have a medium of exchange that nobody has to be in debt for. Today, everybody's got to be in debt to have money, or somebody's got to be in debt to have money, or you can't have any. And if you have more money than what you have debt, let's say you're out of debt, you got a whole bunch of money in the bank. Someone else out there is in debt to the tune of that amount of money, and they can't get out because you got it. And all the time you got it, you're trying to get interest on it, while it's accruing interest on him over here. That's why we got so much debt out there. But anyway, we come back around here now. In the same letter, it goes on further, and it says, in both the goldsmith's practice and in modern banking, new money is created by offering loans to customers. Okay? A private commercial bank, not the Fed, a private commercial bank which has just received extra reserves from the Fed by borrowing reserves, for example, and I know that's kind of silly, they put that by borrowing, kind of legitimize the whole thing, but you know, there's non-borrowed reserves. And you can get into that later. And they're, you know, they don't have to borrow reserves. But they put that in there, I think, just to make the reader look like this is a whole legitimate outfit, whole thing's legitimate here. But that private commercial bank can make roughly $6 in loans for every $1 in reserves it obtains from the Fed. How does it get $6 from $1? Does anybody know how they get $6 from $1? Can you reach in your pocket and put $1 out there and turn it into $6? How do they do that? Okay, but you can't be a banker until you know how to do it. Okay. It simply makes book entries for you, its loan customers, that says it's in there. You have a deposit of $6 with us. That's how they do it. It's magic. Just put it in there. You know, and I really don't have any problem with creating money, because I think if we're going to have money, we're going to have to create it. And somebody's going to have to create it. But the problem is they don't give you this money, do they? I mean, can you just walk up to the bank and say, give me some money? They created it. No, you can't. You have to borrow it. So, there we are, right back to those 6 words again. However, in this process, only the principal is created, never the interest. How could that be a problem? How could that be a problem? So I wrote back to the Treasury and I says, well, okay, if all the money is created as a loan, and I borrowed money, and I think some of you probably borrowed some money, all they ever give me was what I asked for, or the principal of the loan. If I wanted to borrow $100, if they thought I was good enough to have it in the first place, they'd borrow me $100. And so I said, well, if it all comes out then as a loan, where do we all get the interest so we can all get out of debt and all pay back our loans? Not just 1 or 2. We all borrowed it. We should all be able to pay it back, shouldn't we? And I couldn't figure out how. So I wrote and I asked him. And he says, in your response to your letter of May 30th, you raised several questions concerning money in the United States. Let's skip down to paragraph 3. The answer to your second question, if all money is created as loan or principal, where does the money come from to pay interest on the borrowed money? And he says, such money comes from the same source that all other money comes from. Well, then it all became perfectly clear to me. You know, and I looked at that and I said, well, that means I must have to borrow the interest too. I mean, if it all came in as a loan, we all borrowed it, you gotta get the interest from the same place. But how does that work? I never went down to borrow the interest. And I never knew nobody ever told me that. You know, and I'd paid back my loans before, but I never had to go borrow the interest. What kind of a statement is that anyway? It comes from the same place the other money comes from. I think he was sticking his tongue out at me. So anyway, I got a little deeper into this and I found out how all this worked, and I kind of wanted to go through that with you today. And this is the most important part. I'll probably go through it a couple of different times. Byron, can you give me a glass of water or something? I want to have to wipe off this chart when I get done. We'll forget about reserves because reserves really don't mean anything. We don't use reserves for money. You and I don't borrow them. We can't get them out. And you'll find out later that reserves aren't anything. And I have my letters from the Treasury back that show you that the reserves are just bookkeeping entries too. Bank, you need some more reserves at your bank? Okay. Well, here. There, you got some more in your bank. Now you can create some more money. Where people get confused on the reserves is we go back to the 1792 Coinage Act. I dug it out of the ground, the mint coined it into money. I took it down to my bank, put it in the bank, and then the bank would loan you or you a gold note based upon my deposit. You see, we all thought that was safe, right? Because the gold backed it. But at that point in time, the new money came into circulation as a debt to us, didn't it? And they switched that right there. We never really picked up on that. And see, that's what we all think the reserves are, is some wonderful, valuable deposit. And as long as they're creating all the money to us as loans based upon some valuable deposit, it's all okay. And that's why a lot of people want to go back to the gold and silver standard. That's fine, thanks. You know, but the problem with the gold and silver standard was that, oh sure, they told us that it was backed by gold and silver. But you know, we all had to borrow it as a loan. We never used the gold or silver. We used the paper that said note on it, evidence of debt. They just kept the gold and silver. They loaned us the debt, and then we're all expected to pay it back with interest. You have to understand, this isn't a question about paper versus metal or gold versus silver or anything. All it's a matter of is wealth versus debt. You know, and I think he was a banker after him. And I'm not down on the bankers because they don't even understand it hurts them too. But if they're willing to sit still long enough and listen, you can point out how it really hurts them too. But afterwards, you know, he said, yeah, Greg, sure, there's a lot of debt out there, but man, there's a lot of wealth out there too. Well, I said, sure, but you can't pay your bills with wealth. You got to use money. And I said, after all, if you guys are so thrilled about all the wealth that's out there, why can't the money be a wealth? Why does the money have to be a debt? I mean, after all, wouldn't you think if you loved wealth so much, you'd want the actual medium of exchange to be a wealth? And he didn't know, had never thought about before. We got to think about some of these things. But anyway, what happens here is when they create the money, and let's say we don't have any economy, there is no medium of exchange. Just imagine this. And we all talk it over and decide we have to have a medium of exchange, and we all just decided that Greg was going to be in charge of it all, and that everybody had to come to me to get it. I'm the only place that has it, and I think it's only right because that we should control all that. And so I create all the money, and when you want some, you come to me, and if I decide you're worthy, I'll loan you some. Okay? And so the first gentleman, let me find is there a gentleman in the audience? What's your name, sir? Yeah.
Bruce?
Bruce? Okay, Bruce, Bruce comes over to me and he says, I need some money, and I think Bruce is a great guy anyway, so I'm gonna loan him some money. And what I do is I make a debit like this of $100 to his loan account. I gotta keep track of that loan, don't I? I gotta put it somewhere. And I could use this pen just like this, or you know, they're kind of fancy with it now. They got them electronic keyboards, you go like that. And in any case, it winds up as it's stored somewhere in a memory somewhere just like this here. You're gonna keep track of it. And you know, this is the first $100. And Bruce, you don't have a savings account. There ain't no money out there. You don't have a checking account. He ain't even bought a billfold yet. And so what I do is I create a checking account for him just as a convenience to him, you know, so he won't get robbed having all that real money on him. He can have it in a check so he won't get mugged, see. So what I do is I create a checking account for him, and over here I credit his checking account $100. I hand Bruce a deposit slip and said, Bruce, I put that money in your checking account for you. And Bruce says, gee, thank you. And now, when Bruce goes out and writes a check, or checks, against that, he puts brand new money into circulation that never existed before. And that's wonderful, because we can have commerce, and now he doesn't have to trade the pig for the cow. He can trade the check for the cow. Nothing really wrong with that. And, but you know, there's just a little part of this, and if you can find me an economics book that explains it and shows it, or any government document, I'd like to see it, because I haven't found one yet. But there's a little part of this equation, and the gentleman at Casey's the other day up in Austin told me, second time I went in there, I said, now have you thought about that interest? He didn't want to even think about it. He says, you know, I took all this in school, but they never talked about that part of it. Boy, he didn't even want to talk about that either. Okay, and let's say I only charge 10% interest. Okay, so Bruce goes out there and he has fun and everything, but to keep this real simple, you know, if Bruce spends his 100 on one of you folks, he's got to get that back, doesn't he, to pay his loan, plus the interest. Well, let's just say he doesn't even spend any of that principal. He's got it, and he kind of likes the feel of it. He's just going to kind of sit around and hang on to it for a while. But, you know, he hangs on to it for 365 days, and at the end of that year, I want to get paid back. Okay, Bruce owes me how much money? Okay, he owes me $110. Pay me back, Bruce. He can't, can he?
No.
There's no money out there. Oh, he could even give me the whole 100 back, couldn't he? Or if I only charged him 1%, he'd owe me $101, but he can't even come up with the 1, can he? And that's okay, because, you know, Bruce did put up his car for collateral for that loan. I'll just take the car and we'll just call it even. But, you know, it's too simple that way. I loan lots of people money. As a matter of fact, I loan, what's your name?
Wanda.
I loan Wanda $100, and you know, Bruce has got his money in his pocket, so I'm not loaning her any deposits in my bank. I'm gonna create it, and then I credit her checking account $100. Now we got $200 in the economy. At the end of the year, what's the total debt load?
$220.
$220. How's that going to work? Works for me, to a point. Well, Bruce now sees, you know, now there's some real opportunity for me to pay back my debt and get my car back. So he goes over here to Wanda and he says, hey Wanda, you know, I cut down a tree in my backyard and I made a wonderful footstool. You know, and at night, if you had this footstool and you went home when you was watching TV, you could put your feet up on it, and I've tried it. Man, you're so comfortable, and it's this experience you've never had before. You'd love it. Wouldn't you like to have a footstool, Wanda? She says, well, yeah, Bruce, I guess I would. how much would you have to have for that footstool? Well, how much do you think Bruce would have to have for the footstool?
$10.
At least $10, wouldn't he? At least. And we won't confuse it with someone making a profit at this point. We'll just keep it real simple. Bruce is just going to get what he needs to get out of debt. So Wanda writes him a check, and we have to debit her checking account $10. That means she's only got 90 in there, right? And up here, we're going to put 10 in Bruce's account. Now, he's got 110, doesn't he? Bruce says, there, that was pretty easy. And he writes me a check for $110. That puts him with nothing in his checking account, doesn't it? There's nothing there, is there? And of course, when you credit over here to his loan account, there's nothing in his loan account anymore either. And that $100 is extinguished. It's uncreated. The opposite way of that it was created. Oh, but there's $10 in here. This is my account over here. I get 10 bucks right there. That's a pretty neat deal. I get $10 for doing nothing at all, really, except and now, but Bruce, he ain't even got any money either. Okay, now Wanda says, I owe Greg $110, and she's only got 90. How much is she short?
$20.
Where's she gonna get it? Did you see how the debt kind of grew and got shortfall? The shortfall got a little bigger that time. I want you to remember the word shortfall. Now, we'll do this again. Who would like to borrow $100 from me?
Sounds like a banker.
Okay. Person number 3.
Oh, I'll volunteer.
What's your name?
Lyle.
I'm going to try to make sure I can remember all the names. Okay, Lyle, he's in the game here, and he borrows 100. And now Wanda's saying, I got to get out of debt here. I got to pay Greg back his money. And so she says, if I spend any of my $90 to create some products to sell, I'll just have to get that $90 back. So I've got 90 and I've got this wonderful footstool. So she goes over to Lyle and she says, Lyle, I just can't enjoy all this comfort myself when I'm at home watching TV at night. You know, I noticed you didn't have a footstool when, you know, and you love to watch TV. And I've tried this one out, just tried it, mind you. It's not even hardly even used, but I just wanted to make sure I wasn't selling bum goods. So I tested it out and it works real good. I'm real comfortable watching TV, pop my feet up there. And she says, Lyle, wouldn't you like to have a footstool like mine? And of course, everybody wants a footstool, right? And Lyle says, yeah, how much would you have to have for the footstool?
$20.
Is that good enough for you? Okay, so Lyle's got to write a check, and here he's going to put some new money in circulation. He puts $20, leaves him with 80. We'll put 20 up here in Wanda's. Now she's got 110. Wanda writes a check to me. That zeroes out her checking account, credit her loan account. The second $100 just got uncreated. Uh-oh. Now, did you folks happen to notice, you know, the footstool was $10, and then it went up to $20.
Inflation.
It's inflation. That's what causes inflation. A shortage of money. Not too much money. I mean, come on. If we had too much money in the economy, why would we give a wink what the Fed would do with interest rates? We wouldn't be borrowing anyway. Did you ever know anybody that had too much money that borrowed? Did you ever know a country that had too much money that was in debt? This system is what causes all your inflation, is what causes the prices and the cost of living to constantly go up. But what you have to understand in this system is that there's never enough money to cover the debt. That's how come when you go back and you think, I guess I can go back far enough to where I remember a new car being about $3,500. But I hear tell there was a time when you could buy a brand new car for 4, 5, 6, 7.
Right.
Why do prices go up? Because we all have too much money and we just want more, so we raise our price? No. They go up because we're short. They have to go up. They had to go up here because the debt was greater than the money supply, and the first guy had to get something out there and then keep increasing the price to cover the debt because the interest is never created. You know, and this is with $100 loans. But man, it's a lot more complicated than that. Out there lending and they're borrowing, lending money and lending borrowed money, and they got, how much are they going to do to our Mexican friends down across the border? They're going to loan them some money too. And we know why they're in the problem that they got in, don't we? Because they got involved with the banks, right? $60 billion at 10% interest. How big of a shortfall is that in the economy? $6 billion. $6 billion.
6 million.
No, there's six. If there was 60 billion, 10% of 60 would be $6 billion. A billion is 1,000 million.
Yeah.
Okay, that's right. But you know, every time they create a bigger loan, depending on the percentage rate, it's kind of like blowing into a balloon that can never deflate back again. The balloon gets big and the shortfall stays out there. And it can be shared by one or many people, like our wonderful national debt. And you see, we wouldn't even have a national debt if we the people weren't going to our congressmen and government screaming to take care of us because we can't seem to take care of ourselves anymore. You can't say, oh, you can't talk to your family, we need a new car, let's save up and buy a new car. How long would it take you today to save up to buy that car that's down on the showroom floor today? Let's say it costs $16,000. If you're going to start saving today to buy that car.
A lot less time than it's going to take to pay for it after you buy it.
You know, I really don't even have an answer for the question, but to me, it seems by the time I saved the $16,000 to buy the car, the same car would cost $20 or $25 because of this system. Why do we have to go to the bank to have anything? It just can't work enough to get the money for it anymore because of the spread. But this is what's bad about the debt, the national debt and the private debt. It's in the prices. But that doesn't mean that the money's out there to pay the prices. And every time you take your paycheck home at the end of the week and the prices go up, but your paycheck doesn't it mean you're going to have to give up one of them things you used to buy last week? Because the money doesn't cover it? And this is why a lot of people are concerned about property taxes, especially you take a lot of our elderly people. And hopefully, God willing, I'm going to be an elderly person someday. But you know, they work all their lives, and most of them, I think, honestly and fairly. But once you get a certain age, your earning power goes down. Physically, mentally, you don't have the ability to go out there and do it every day like you used to. But meanwhile, the prices keep going up, caused by this debt credit system. And if that elderly person's prescription goes up $5, it can be a very traumatic thing for them. And if the government can't get enough out of you for income taxes, they work on your property taxes. And that little old lady or little old man that had a house they worked all their life for, and you know, a lot of these elderly people, that's all they got. They got their house and a TV and a footstool. And we've allowed our government to say, that's okay, we can tax that property that they worked all their life for. And if they can't afford the property taxes, there goes your house. And then we got to create some social program for homeless people.
Yeah, Now, but if you're the banker, you got the home equity loan.
And you know, the thing is that as a banker, all my people are screaming about their groceries when they go out and buy them costing more and more all the time. The car costs more and more all the time. When I want to put new carpet in the bank, the carpet costs more and more all the time because the bankers aren't insulated from consumption. They have to consume too. In the next newsletter, Money Talks, we're going to go through 10 borrowers at $100. And I'll show you how it hurts the banks too. Because when it gets down to this last person and they can't pay that loan back, the bank has to pay for that bad debt dollar for dollar out of its interest income profit account. If they can't cover off those bad debts dollar for dollar, it puts the bank under, and then another bigger, stronger, healthier bank comes along and buys up most of the good stuff. They don't want to buy any of the bad stuff. You and me pay for the bad stuff. How do we pay for it? We go borrow some more money, and then they tax our loans away from us. And what happens in the process is you have fewer and fewer banks, but they get bigger and bigger. And the property that we all work for falls in the hands of fewer and fewer people, and they have more and more control over it. And you can see this. Look at your Congress. We're all looking at it, man. Our government don't listen to us anymore. We got no control over our government. Don't we say we got to have something about campaign reform and PAC committees and how much they can donate? And isn't money kind of bothering us about how it all works in our politics? Well, you know, if I could create all the money all the time, and you all had to borrow it from me and pay it back with interest, you'd all be in debt to me, and I could just dictate your lives, couldn't I? And then make you believe for some reason that by raising the interest rates and slowing this economy down so we don't all overheat, like the space shuttle coming back into Earth, and we don't slow it down, we're all going to burn out because we're just doing so good, and we believe that. So anyway, I can demonstrate this a little bit further about how the only way you can increase the money supply in this debt credit system is through borrowing, using a chart that I got from the Federal Reserve Bank. It starts in 1959. And it covers the years up to 1993. And it starts over here and it lists, you've got, they call them aggregates, M1, M2, M3, how they keep track of all how much money's out there. But you know, in 1959 you had $140 billion in the M1 money supply, which is coins, bills, checkbooks, now accounts, money that you and I use every day that we have access to exchange goods and services with. Okay? The total liquidity of the country, which would be other loans, remember now, all your savings accounts is somebody else's loan. All your CDs, all your money market funds, anything that we think is money is somebody's loan. Some government, individual, or company went into debt in the first place to create the money as a loan, or you wouldn't be able to deposit it. That total amount of money was just about $400 billion. And this isn't all the debt, but the non-financial sector debt was just about $700 billion. So in '59, you had $400 billion in money, and you had $700 billion in debt. That just comes right back to Wanda and Bruce and Lyle. You can go back to '59, the debt wasn't so big, car didn't cost so much. House didn't cost so much. Okay, now you just watch it, man. She just grows, they borrow more and more money, and now you get up to 1993, you got about 1.2 trillion out there that we can spend every day. And the total debt was 12 trillion. You wonder why things are getting expensive? Because that interest debt has to be passed on in the price of goods and services. But unless you increase the money supply by the same amount, you're going to have a big spread in there that can't be met. And in order for you to get ahead, someone else has to go behind. And I've had people tell me, well, that's just fine, Greg. I'm just doing just fine. I'm got a big savings account and I'm doing good. And what do I care about it anyway? Well, do I have to remind you how big your income tax bill is getting every year? Oh, don't remind them about that. See, because what happens, even if you get ahead and turn around and tax it away from you to create a social program to pay for the one that didn't make it, yet the debt still keeps growing. the cost of doing business, the cost of living keeps going up and up and becomes more and more unmeetable every year. And that's where we're at in this country right now. You can, when you leave the meeting today, as soon as you turn on your car radio, get a news report, you won't have to listen very long to hear some complaint, problem with money. And what question keeps coming up with America now, and it comes up in my mind all the time, and I look out there, read the newspaper, watch TV, and say, why is everything getting so expensive? The next question is, where are we going to get the money to pay for it all? And so this chart here shows you how the money supply grows through borrowing, and the debt has to constantly grow. Here's a similar chart, goes from 1929 to 1989. The left column shows the year, and as you come over, it's the federal tax revenues in billions, and the next one is the federal deficit or surplus. Most of the time it's a deficit. And the next column is the public debt. And the far right column is your bankruptcies per 1,000 people. And you see, regardless of how much they take in taxes, kind of has a tendency to grow how much they take in taxes. And the deficit, except for a few years, and you got to get through the fact here they confiscated the gold in '33, and we kept rolling into this debt credit system, then you had some more, but basically the federal deficit got bigger and bigger and bigger. The public or government debt just gets bigger, 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 bigger. And then over here, the personal and business bankruptcies per 1,000 gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, because the only way some of this debt can be washed out is through bankruptcy with property. But I mean, you just can't. How much bankruptcy are we going to have to wipe out all this debt that we have now? My name's Greg Soderberg, in case some of you come in after this morning. I'm with the Coalition to Reform Money, and what we'd like to do is we'd like to change the way money is created in our country, and we'd like to change the way that money comes into circulation when it is created. And that's what I've been talking about this morning. We could probably bring some people up to speed by getting the answers to a couple of questions. And there's 3 questions, and I'm looking for 3 answers. The first question is, what is it that we do use for money in this country?
Yeah. Federal Reserve notes.
We use bank credit for money. How is that money created?
Off of a printing press. By the extension of the
Okay. It's created with a debit to a loan account and a credit to a checking account on the books of a bank. And then how does that money get into circulation so you and I can use it?
You gotta borrow.
There's a sharp gentleman back there. That's right, you have to borrow it first. It's created as a loan, and when you spend that money or write a check, you put new money into circulation that never existed before, and all new money is created that way. There is no way, even if you want to go out and work for it honestly, decently, fairly, and squarely, that you can have any money without someone being in debt for it. So, those are the answers to the questions. And as far as they just printed or we use Federal Reserve notes, you know, you couldn't even have Federal Reserve notes until somebody first, like Bruce, with that first $100 loan went to the bank. Bank created that money as a debit to a loan account and a credit to a checking account. There's no Federal Reserve notes there. that has to happen first. And then to get the Federal Reserve notes into circulation, Bruce would have to write a check for cash against his checking account. And say it was for $10, they would debit his checking account $10, so he'd have 90 in his checking account, and they would give him a $10 Federal Reserve note, or 2 5s, or 5 and 5 1s, or 10 1s, however he wanted it. It wouldn't change the money supply, it would just change the form of the money, and now he would have a green Federal Reserve note that is an evidence of that loan transaction. You see, so we don't just print up the money. The government just doesn't print up the money. We don't even really use Federal Reserve notes for money. We use bookkeeping entries.
Ray, you got a question back there?
Oh, okay.
Two, when you get a chance, I think you need to explain the federal level in regard to the government borrowing off the Federal Reserve. Because you're explaining the private level, right?
It all works the same.
Yeah, it all works the same.
It all works the same.
Whether the government borrowed it, you borrow it, the process is exactly the same.
Yeah.
You make a debit to a loan account, whether it's a loan account to a government, federal, state, city, or you. They enter that into somebody's checking account. If that doesn't happen, not one penny money goes into circulation. Federal Reserve notes that they print, unless they're counterfeit, we're going to show you some of them actual, it's so different in a little bit, you can't tell the difference. That, they can't get into circulation until you have the credit in the bank, you or somebody borrowed. You must draw that down and take the bills out of the bank. So the bills do not come in unless you buy them dollar for dollar with the credit to the bank that you first had to borrow, you or someone else.
So the government goes in debt the way, when they need money that they don't have enough tax money, they go into debt and get it the same way you and I do. They get a loan for it. But, and we went through this morning about how the money supply is only increased through borrowing. If we don't create more loans, we can't create any more money. We have to go deeper in debt to have more money. And of course, you saw through Bruce, Wanda, and is it Lyle?
Yes.
Through your 3 loans there, that for every person the debt got larger and more unpayable. And then we went through some charts and we tried to show you that. I showed you the Federal Reserve Bank's own charts when they kept track of the money supply from 1959 to 1993. And I showed you another chart on how the bankruptcies increased. And now I'm going to show you something else here regarding that. This is a copy out of Barron's Financial Magazine, and what I'm going to show you here is the total amount of money that's out there. And this is real interesting. If you ever go to a meeting where they have a congressman or a senator or one of your representatives speaking about how they're going to solve all these problems, you might kind of open that whole conversation up with a question and ask them, how much money is there in the economy? And when I asked them that, they ain't none of them that even knew. And you know, at my house, before I can start talking about how I'm going to solve my money problems and pay my bills, I kind of got to know how much money there is to work with in the first place. And what we have here is, this is August 22nd. It hasn't changed really that much since August 22nd last year. But the M1 money supply, again, that's checks, now accounts, coins, bills, money that you and I pay for our dinner upstairs with, or who somebody else pays for my dinner with. That's what we use in everyday transactions. Savings accounts are not in the M1 because we don't use those. We've got to go and get the money out before we can use it. But the M1 was $1.2 trillion. The total liquidity of the country, if you take all the savings accounts, the euro dollars, the repurchase agreements, the CDs, the money market funds, anything the banks call money, the total supply of that is $5 trillion. And it's all a debt, because remember, that money wouldn't even exist if somebody wasn't in debt for it. And it's all accruing interest. And now, we've got ourselves in a situation in America where we're all supposed to be very concerned about the national debt. And it's $4.7 trillion. Now you saw how money was extinguished when each of these people paid back their loans. Now, can you imagine if we really wanted to get our country out of debt, if we paid the $4.7 trillion, you wouldn't have any money hardly. because you'd erase $4.7 trillion of the 5.2. You'd have about a half a trillion dollars left over to do business with. Okay, and this shows the money supply. And we're concerned about the national debt. And I don't know why. Can anybody here tell me why I should be concerned about the national debt? I mean, Dan Rather hasn't told me why. And Ted Koppel, he hasn't really told me why either. And I want to know, since we're all willing to be taxed more, or whatever it takes to get rid of that national debt, why do we want to get rid of the national debt? Why does that hurt us? Why is it detrimental? Is there anybody that can give me any idea?
Interest.
Well, what about the interest?
The money that pays the interest is non-existent. Just,
Well, why are we all trying to pay it then?
yeah.
Well, the international bankers are going to end up with that as interest that they're going to collect on this.
But Bill Clinton never told me to pay the national debt for the international bankers.
I know.
But well,
A lot
why?
of things he doesn't tell you.
Well, I know that, but I mean, come on, people, we're going to pay it, right? We all think it's really important. Boy, the country's in debt. Well, let me tell you. I saw a book once by the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago that listed the total debt as $26 trillion. Did you guys hear that figure lately anywhere?
40 trillion.
Where'd you hear that one? I haven't heard 40.
In the spotlight.
Okay. Where did Spotlight get it?
I don't know. Well, they had quite an article by their economist that died recently, that 90-year-old, 92 or 3-year-old, or 60.
Was it by accident or?
But, no, he was 96 years old.
Okay, well, no, I just trying to be a little sick humor there, but anyway.
No, but it showed that what they call it, the increase in this is skyrocketing.
Sure, you know, because it compounds. They all sell us on the idea of putting our bank loans in IRAs and things like that, and they show you this, well now, Fred, now when you put that money in here the first year or two, it really don't grow very much. But Fred, don't worry, see down here, 5, 10 years, see how she really starts going. Well, that's all what our money is. We're going to have this debt growing and growing, but I guess I wrote to the Fed and I said, now your book said 26 trillion, is that true? And they wrote me back a letter here in April 6th of 1994. It's from the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago. And it says that, yeah, $26 trillion in debt, and most of it accrues interest. How much is difficult to tell. Yet they use interest rates to keep from overheating the economy, from getting too much money out there. Yet a lot of stuff tells me that they don't even know what's going on out there. But why don't we hear about the 26 trillion? Why are we, as a nation, 4.7 trillion in debt in the hole? We're just all shook up about paying that national debt. If you paid it off, you'd only have $500 billion left, all the debt accruing interest, and you'd still have over $20 trillion us out here. You know, so, you know, this is something that we have to think about too, because basically this is why everything's getting so expensive. Because the interest isn't money. It's just a debt, but it's a debt expected to be paid in money. Here's another chart. If you go back to 1960, your M1 money supply was 141 billion. The total liquidity was 400 billion. And gee whiz, the debt's already almost twice as much as the money supply in 1960. What did a new car cost in 1960? What did a new house cost in 1960? In 1970, 10 years later, your money supply goes up through borrowing. Your liquidity doubles. Golly, your total public and private debt doubles too. Now you got $1.5 trillion in 1970 in total public and private debt. You only got $8 trillion or 800 billion in money. 1970, did the cars go up in price in 10 years? Did the houses go up in price? Did you have to go to the bank more and more to borrow the money because you'd never be able to save it up in time to buy what you wanted? In 1980, there she goes up again. The money supply goes up and liquidity up, and now the debt just about tripled. And this $26 trillion figure was 4 years ago at the end of 1990. You had just about $1 trillion in the M1. Your liquidity was about $5 trillion, and then it went, your total public and debt, private debt went to $26 trillion. It was last year sometime they said on the radio that the average car cost $16,000. About 3-4 weeks ago, they said the average car cost about $20,000. About over that same time frame, they said on the radio the average home cost $105,000. I don't live in an average home, but then just a few weeks ago it said the average home was $155,000. But yet they've been telling you, we don't really, well, we're just trying to stay ahead of inflation. We don't want inflation to rear its ugly head. But you see, we have constant inflation. Just look back historically, from the time you were a child till now. What they don't tell you is, yeah, we only had 1.5% inflation last year. But what they don't tell you, that's 1.5 on top of the 1.5 you had the year before, and the year before, and the year before. And this is why you talk about the United Nations, totalitarian socialism. How do you get people to accept socialism? Remember when you're in school, they used to tell us, boy, you know, people when they're poor and when they're broke and they're hungry, they'll accept anybody for their leader that promises some food. Well, we was never going to be that way in America. But you see, if you put yourself deep enough in debt as a people, because this is all of our debt, and you got it whether you think you're out of debt or not, because every day you go out in the marketplace, you purchase the debt in the prices of the things you buy. And as it gets harder and harder to make ends meet, and this is what I opened the meeting with this morning was, you got any problems with money in Iowa? You got any problems with money in the United States? Everybody's wondering where we're going to get the money from? Then people have a tendency, as they get stressed, to accept more government control. This is what's happened in the country. And this is how people are, how come they're concerned about militias, and they're concerned about Waco incidences, and they're concerned about the stuff that's in the food. Basically, all what this is about is being a free people again. What we're realizing is how much in servitude we've become. And it's been done through the monetary system because they've changed it over the years. They passed some bad laws. And of course, we the people never really kept track of it. We thought America was great, and it'll be great forever. It was great when I got here, it'll be great when I'm gone. Nobody really keeps track of it. It just always goes good in America. But it slips away. And this is what happened. So you can see here as the debt grows, and you can imagine by the year 2000, if you think things are expensive now, imagine what they're going to be in a few years down the road. And what's going to happen to your standard of living? It'll get lower and lower, because if you take your $100 paycheck out today and you buy 10 items, and the following week those 10 items go up in price, you're going to have to go without one of them, aren't you? And then your standard of living will go down. And I've been asked about this collapse, and I hear about this collapse of the economy. The only time there's going to be a collapse is when it benefits a few who design the collapse. But see, we even recover from collapses. We let that happen. 1907 they had what you could call a collapse. 1930s they had a collapse. But we're strong people. We just bounce right back, and we work that much harder. But you see, what's going to happen is as long as you and I will accept ever-increasing prices and working harder and harder to maintain our standard of living, but probably to have a lower standard of living, there ain't nothing going to change. As long as we're willing to be fools and be fooled, there ain't going to be no collapse. It will just go the way you've seen it going. Things will get worse and worse. And the people will go to their government. When me and Byron were in Washington, we saw 47 congressmen last year. Face to face, we had meetings set up with them, and they all agreed. Everybody who comes into our office has their hand out. And that ain't what the people that founded this country, the people that came over in the boats, didn't have their hands out. The only time they had their hand out was when they was working with it. And the people go there and they say, look, I got to have some money because I'm laid off, I'm out of work, my company went belly up or something, you got to do something to get me some money in my hand. Or, you've got to pass a law so that my company can have a leg up on my competition and so that I can survive. what happened that we're the kind of people that carved a nation out of the wilderness with hardship, tears, and fears, and suffering, and disease, and famine, and all, you name it, to a people now that we can't do anything without the government. And they've done it through this here, because if you can go out and work and trade your production one for one without being in debt for it, you don't need no government. But when you can't afford it, can't afford to make ends meet, I'm sorry, no matter what kind of a strong-willed person you are, eventually you get to the point where you're going to the government. And this is why you're going to have complete more socialism. This is why you're fighting this thing all the time, socialism, because this money system puts people in a hurt and promotes socialism. And just a couple more examples here, and you may have seen these before. Byron has done these charts a couple times before, but again, you go back. In 1959, it took 3.5 cows to buy a new pickup truck. The pickup cost $1,260. In 1990, it took 21.5 cows to buy a pickup truck, and the truck cost $20,000. Now, what happened there? Did the cows change? The cows didn't change. What happened is all the debt and unpayable cost of capital went into every vendor and automotive manufacturer that made this car. They put that debt, that unpayable debt, in that car. And at $20,000, it put a lot more pickup trucks out of reach from people when it used to be a lot more of them could buy them at $1,260. Now, the problem with the farmer or raw producer, he can't mark up, can he? These people, when they sold that footstool, they could mark it up and try to cover their costs. Don't mean it's out there just because they mark it up. Can the farmer go out there and say, oh, wait a minute, I ain't taking that for my cattle. I'm going to mark them up to this. I want this much for them. Don't happen. So he sits down there and he just got to put out more and more volume all the time. And of course, all his vendors are passing their costs of debt on to him. That's what these farmers, and I can show you the Federal Reserve chart itself. The only business I know in this country they can spend more than it takes in, and that's farming, and still stay in business. And it's about 25% difference between what they take in and what they put out. It's been that way for years and years. It's getting worse all the time. I think farmers are hard-working people, really. They do a lot for the labor they put out compared to the people sitting in offices, and myself too, personally. I don't labor that hard. But they sure get ripped off. Here's another chart. In 1953, it took 1,150 bushels a week to purchase a new Buick car. In 1990, it took 10,000 bushels a week. And look at, even in 1990, it was $2.30, 30 cents more a bushel than it was in 1953. The wheat didn't change. What did change? Right here. All the debts in the finished goods. You can't add it. You can't add it onto the raw goods. You got to add it onto the finished goods. And then just one other slant on this. I ran into a fellow who run a furniture store up. I was calling on him, and he said, you know, back in 1870, we used to sell a brand new wooden kitchen chair. These aren't wood here, but the computer lady didn't have a wooden chair, so you gotta use your imagination. But in 1870, Mart's Furniture in Leroy, Minnesota, sold a brand new wooden kitchen chair for 30 cents. You know, I don't even think you can go to Kmart and get one for 30 cents today. And I said, wow, you know, 30 cents? And of course he said, yeah, but you gotta remember, we make a lot more money now, so things should cost more. And isn't that the usual? And I used to say that myself too, you know, but I didn't know any better. But I said, well, wait a minute. Let's think about that. I did some research. I went to the library and looked around and called the Minnesota Department of Economics, if you can believe anything they say. And they said the average hourly wage in 1870 was 18 3/4 cents an hour. That meant that that person had to work 1.6 hours to buy a new kitchen chair. And true, today we do make more or earn more per hour, $8.23 average after taxes. But the average chair is running about $100. I even call out to the East Coast. They laughed at me and says, well, our chairs cost about $500. And I knew at Kmart you'd get them for $39.95, so I call them $100, and I think that's a fair comparison. But even though the chair costs more and we earn more, it takes almost 12 and a half hours to buy the kitchen chair. Now what's going to happen as the system rolls on, is eventually you ain't going to be able to work enough hours to have anything. Because you can't keep increasing the wage to cover the price, because that's got to go in the price. So wages always got to be kept down, okay? And you won't even be able to go to the bank and borrow the money. Because the bank will say, well, let's see, you make so much an hour, so much a year, blah, 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 blah. Say, well, you're never even going to be able to work enough to pay for that thing. And so what will come around is, if we're willing to maintain this system, is with this work, basically, what you see on TV, them little thin little kids with their eyes bugging out from starvation, or, you know, flies crawling all over their face, if we let this system continue, because the rest of the world's been on this system longer than we have. We're just young kids coming onto this system. That's the way we're going to look if we're willing to go that far. And Byron's going to go through the solution to this problem, which is already in legislative form. It's called the Money Reform Act. It's been hand-delivered to the 102nd Congress. We're looking for sponsors, somebody that would introduce the bill on the House floor, at least for the sake of getting the American people aware of this and letting them talk about it, at least as they do about O.J. Simpson and the Balanced Budget Amendment. So I think if enough people out there heard this message, we'd be talking about it, and we'd fix it, and we could get it fixed. But in the meantime, I want to just put a plug in here for the Money Talks News Journal. We just started putting this out in May, and it goes through what I've gone through here with you this morning, but it goes through it over and over again so you can understand it. And we don't get way off in left field on different issues. We stick to this one issue. So if you want to understand the money, this is a good newspaper to get. It's $26 for 12 issues. If you sign up for it today, we'll give you 2 of the back issues at no charge. And if you just want to buy just one issue today, they're $2.75. You may think that's quite a bit of money to pay for a newsletter, but when you see what's inside of it, you'll see that it's information you can get anywhere else, and that nobody else is talking about. It's good information that you can use and carry out of here with you, and maybe make a difference and educate your friends. And you know, if you know Byron, he's not in it to earn a big profit and get rich doing this. And the reason we charge for all this stuff is because I'm not willing to put all my salary that goes towards my family towards this and let them go without. So basically we charge for it because we need the money to print it, and postage and telephone calls and running all over the country and going to Washington, D.C. And if we really want to have a free country where the government's going to leave you alone, then you're going to have people that can take care of themselves and can go out in the morning and work and be prosperous without having to depend on the government. And if we don't change this money issue, and it got changed once, we had wealth money from 1792 till 1873, you and I could get our money coined free of charge. But Congress passed some bad laws and they changed it. Most of the people didn't even really know they were making a change. But we can pass some good laws and we can change it. And you can also go home today, tomorrow actually on Monday, call your congressman, call your senator, your representative, and talk to them about it. Hey, you mean we all got to be in debt to have any money at all? How's that supposed to work? I want it changed. I don't want my neighbor to have to be in debt so that I can have some in my savings account. And then I sure as heck don't want you coming taxing me to take care of him. And talk about it to your neighbors. And call us if you have any questions. And if you want us to meet with somebody, or if you can get us on the radio somewhere, on a television show or something, we'll come down, we'll do it. And the best thing you can do, what we've read, I'd really like to have it happen. Byron, I don't think is excited about it as I am. But I'd like to get a meeting with 2 or 3 congressional U.S. congressmen and a couple of senators and their best economics person all together in one room and go head to head. If you could arrange that, I'd like to have that happen too. And I'd like to have it televised if you could make that happen. Because if we're wrong, I want somebody to show us where we're wrong. And if it's right what we're talking about, then let's fix it. But they're always telling us, go meet with the congressman. And we meet with him, and he says, well, I don't know about all that. Why don't you go talk to Joe Economist over here? Okay, so you go talk to Joe Economist, and most of the time they'll come around and say, well, yeah, you're right, but I can tell the congressman that. But if you get them all together at once, then we can just find out who's who.
They'll lie to each other.
Well, that's right. And so I really appreciate your opportunity and participation and for listening to me today. And I hope I made some sense to you. You know, get the News Journal, talk to us some more if you have some questions. I didn't understand this the first time I heard it. And it takes 4 or 5 exposures to really start having this thing gel in your mind. But man, this is the most important issue that we can address in this country today. Thank you.